Great. Welcome back. Move into a discussion about the Act 72 schools facility assessment that the legislature commissioned. For those following on Zoom or YouTube, the material that we're going to talk about can be found on our website under the date of January 3rd and the names of our witnesses. So just remember committee back in 21, the legislature passed Act 72, which called for both an inventory and then an assessment of all of our public school buildings in order to get a handle on the needs across the state and to help provide the data we need to address school construction aid. And so this is an excellent way for us to enter the topic of school construction aid, which we'll deal with coming up, but to sort of get a sense of, okay, here's the work that's been done and here's what the state needs are going forward. And I'll just warn everybody, it's going to be a little bit eye-popping, but keep our optimism high. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Briggs Campbell, who himself and Bob Donahue, our other witness both from the Agency of Education, been heading up this project. Please take it away.
So much, and welcome back to State House. So for the record, Jill Briggs Campbell, the Agency of Education Director of Operations. So I'll actually take just a brief moment because we've had a little bit of an organizational change that's reflected in this work. For the first time, the agency has an operations team that I lead and work directly under Interim Secretary Boucher. And on my team is Bob Donahue, who is the agency's first ever school facilities program manager. And Bob joined our team in May of 23, thankfully, and brings a wealth of expertise and a lifetime of work in this area that I'm very grateful for, because he's really jumped in with both feet and has kind of shepherded the facilities assessment through to completion and provided a lot of technical expertise to the school construction task force. So very thankful to have him. I'm going to speak very, very briefly and then leave it to Bob. I just want to kind of take that couple of steps back and remind us of what was in Act 72, what work has already been done and what the purpose was of this statewide facilities assessment. And then as soon as possible, I will hand it to Bob to sort of describe what we learned. You all should have your slide deck, so if you want to follow along, I'm on slide 3. As Representative Conlon pointed out, back in 2007, the Vermont General Assembly suspended state aid for construction, which you'll be talking quite a lot more about. In the ensuing 16 years, a growing backlog of deferred maintenance and renovation projects has resulted, and we will discuss what that looks like. And Act 72 in 2021 is really sort of an omnibus, I would say, school facilities bill, and it's all aimed towards identifying baseline measurements. What is the state of the state when it comes to our school buildings? And then also working towards establishing quality standards. How should, moving forward, our school facilities be managed and operated? So it includes a lot of different elements that are not essential to this, but it does include things like every district shall have a 5-year capital plan. Every district shall have a person identified within the district who is responsible for facilities management and has appropriate training and certification. So all of these things are aimed towards a future state that hopefully also includes a state construction aid program. So the purpose of doing a statewide facilities assessment is really because, first of all, we've never done it before. We have no sort of baseline understanding really of what the condition of our facilities are. I think we know anecdotally what those conditions are, but we really needed to have a shared understanding. To begin with, we actually did a self-reported facilities inventory, and that was completed in I'm starting to lose track because we've been at this for a while, 2021. And that inventory, it was self-reported. Bob is going to describe the difference between that inventory and what those measures are versus the assessment, because those numbers actually look different, and we want to explain why. It's because they were measuring different things. In the last year, beginning last fall in 2022, we contracted with Bureau Veritas Technical Assessments, BVTA, to conduct a statewide facilities assessment. And it's a comprehensive assessment, the elements of which are actually defined in Act 72. And so, again, Bob will be sharing exactly what those elements were. And we want to sort of hone in on what the purpose was. So, again, facilities assessment was undertaken to gather baseline data as to the overall condition of school facilities on like a statewide portfolio level, so that we can really begin to sort of compare apples to apples, right? There's also a recognition in Act 72 that not all districts are resourced equally. So we do have some districts who have already done, frankly, much more comprehensive facilities assessments as part of capital planning. They may have a major construction or renovation project coming up. But we also know that there's many, many districts who have never done this work before. And so this is really about equity, right? So have a shared common understanding of data, and then also ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to have this information available. Also, I want to emphasize that this school facilities assessment is the start of the work, frankly. It's the beginning of a robust facilities management process moving forward. So this is not the end point. And part of that is that all of the data gathered from the facilities assessment is going to reside in a database that all districts will have access to in perpetuity. And I want to sort of highlight that's a major success. Most states, even though they may have state construction aid programs, they may be farther along than us in a lot of ways. Most states do not have access to this kind of tool, and it's going to be really powerful. That tool will also have a public-facing dashboard. We're working, this is kind of our next phase of work that will be completed in September 30th of 2024 this year, a public-facing dashboard that is driven by that database. The database can be accessed and updated and maintained by our districts. And in addition, it can be used to drive the 5-year capital plans. So we're really bringing a lot of different pieces of work into alignment. And again, it's all about creating sort of quality systems within our districts moving forward, with the end goal that if we do end up restarting a state construction aid program, that we can have some confidence that those state dollars are going to systems that are stable, well-maintained, and that there's going to be good stewardship of those state dollars. So the assessment in total covered 384 public school buildings. Some of those are campuses, some of those are individual school buildings. And I think with that, you're on slide 7, if you're following along, we can actually kick it over to Bob, and he'll discuss what we found and give you some of those numbers.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great. Can you all hear me?
Yep. Thank you, Bob.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah. So for the record, I'm Bob Donahue. As Jill said, I joined EAOE about 6 months ago in the capacity of School Facilities Program Manager, and I'm here to really help the state implement any of the mandates of Act 72 as best we can in a timely way. So Jill did a wonderful job summarizing the first few slides, so it made a nice, easy segue into what I'm going to cover here. So I'm going to basically, for your benefit, start at the school level, what constitutes a facilities assessment at the school level, and then we'll work our way aggregating all of those school facility assessments for individual schools and districts up to the state level and what that means for the state in terms of the opportunities they have to impact the benefits of facility infrastructure upgrades. So there are different levels of school facilities assessment that anybody can engage with the contractor to procure on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the least intense and 5 being the most intense. Our level is around a level 2. So it's not that it's a very cursory assessment. but it doesn't have the fine engineering detail that some school districts might have engaged in if they were contemplating a construction project. So given that it's a level 2, people go in, they talk to the points of contact at the school. If they have their time to walk with the assessors, they did do that. If they didn't, the assessors had to make some well-informed conclusions on their own based upon their experience and their wheelhouse of expertise, whether it was engineering or architecture. So they take a look at 15 major systems that comprise a typical school building. And those are all along the lines of the systems that we are all familiar with, whether they're electrical, plumbing, fire alarms, fire protection systems, fire suppression systems, heating, venting, air conditioning, roofing, siding, windows, flooring. Those are the major systems. And then outside, they take a look at the grounds in terms of playgrounds and ADA accessibility from external areas into the building itself. So it's a broad brush look, but it's not that it's so cursory that they're not catching things of detail that of importance to the school district and ultimately to the state level. So when they start looking at everything, they have really one basic thing that they're looking at. What is the state of the equipment or the component of a system currently? And if it's not past its useful life, how many years left does that piece of equipment have left before it's consumed its useful life and now has to be replaced? And these are kind of important ideas to keep in your mind as we move forward, because I'll be coming back to them again and again. So I'm on slide 8 of the slide deck if you're following along. So the deferred maintenance and short-term needs are really things that they're capturing of things that have been neglected, either through lack of money, no spare parts, or what have you. And that deferred maintenance is building a backlog of things that ultimately can lead to an emergency situation. So those two categories, the deferred maintenance and short-term needs, are kind of something where when they identify something in this category, it's something that we should be paying attention to, because they feel in their assessment risk analysis, they're saying this is something that we ought to be addressing in the short term rather than long term. The long range capital plan, as Jill alluded to, with the 5-year capital plan, that's composed of systems and components of systems that they've identified as having remaining useful life in them. And so therefore, they're not an immediate concern from a spending priority, but they put them in the calendar year based upon the remaining useful life that the school should anticipate spending money on those assets. So it's a great way to build up a 20-year capital plan, knowing that every system is being analyzed in terms of how much remaining useful life exists in that system. So if they say the roof is a 40-year roof and we're 30 years into it, they know in 2034, we're going to have to put a new roof on. So it's that kind of systematic approach to categorizing the different systems, discovering what their remaining useful life is, and then based upon that, projecting into the future when we might be expected to have to spend capital monies for their replacement. Then they took a look at a very high-level ADA review of each facility. This is not a detailed review, and every school in the assessment was recommended to do an additional detailed ADA review, not only of the exterior grounds, but then the interior workings of the building. So every one of the schools has a recommendation for a further analysis with ADA compliance. Anything that was grossly out of compliance, they flagged as an immediate need. Then there was a level 2 energy audit, which is interesting in that it can provide insight to the different power sources in a school, whether it's electric, biomass, oil, or propane or natural gas. And then they take a look at the prevailing costs of those utilities if it wasn't provided by the school. A lot of the schools did provide what were their actual billings so that they could then develop what they call an environmental conservation measure list of low-lying fruit that schools may want to consider chasing as a means of reducing their global footprint and reducing their energy bills and being somewhat compliant with an initiative to try and become as environmentally carbon neutral as possible. The PCB cost estimate is just something that was a line item that for those schools where PCB testing was done and we knew what the impacted square footage was, we put a placeholder of $500 per square foot just to hold the dollar value placeholder. not that it's necessarily related to a realistic dollar value for the remediation or dealing with the PCBs at all. We just needed to account for it somehow. And then the STEM and STEAM evaluation was a self-assessment by the school that they originally took a look at. And then based upon the assessment team going in and looking at what are the spaces for STEM, STEAM, and then do those spaces have the technology and equipment to support the STEM, STEAM education curriculum. And then they came up with a scorecard if the school met that or not. Many of the schools do not have outstanding STEM, STEAM ratings. And that's something that part of the construction task force, hopefully we can address. Capacity was a survey that was sent out, and that was more along the lines of self-assessment. Do they have enough spaces for instruction, enough spaces for support staff offices, enough spaces for one-on-one counseling or any kind of special services that students required? That is an eye-opening assessment there, because it has highlighted that necessarily fixing a building and its physical attributes doesn't necessarily deal with any of the issues that this capacity survey identified. And then size verification is a simple one. It's what is the square footage of the school? That becomes important as we move down further in the slide deck towards the facility condition index, because the index is based upon, it's a calculation that uses the current replacement value of a school, and that replacement value is typically based upon what is the unit cost for construction in building a building. And so that square footage verification needs to be done so that we don't skew the FCI index incorrectly. Okay, I'm going to move on to slide 9. They have some terminology that they use in all the assessments that is very relatable to anything that we talk about. They have a condition assessment that is anywhere from failed up to excellent. So it goes from, geez, this thing is broken, we need to fix it, or it's in excellent shape because we did just replace it and or fix it. So they categorize these the equipment according to these condition ratings. And you may start hearing some feedback from the field that indicates, geez, some of these assessments of condition don't jive with what the local school district may think. And that's a valid statement, in that sometimes they use the word failed to denote a system that isn't necessarily not working, but it may be an important system that has no spare parts available, and therefore it compromises the integrity of the security of the building if it's a fire alarm system and it's a legacy product for which there are no spare parts. Even though it may be functioning today, many of the fire alarm panels out there are like one circuit board away from failure. And so they're not saying that it's failed, but if it does fail, the ramifications of that are pretty large. And so they're highlighting it accordingly. I'm trying to go fast so we can get to the more important stuff at the later slides. So if I'm going too fast, just tell me to slow down. So we have an assessment of what the condition is from failed to excellent. Then they throw it into it. They also throw it into a category of plan type. And this is kind of important because it can help prioritize when talking about the whole portfolio of buildings, where we want to focus our energies. And some of these, again, are pretty intuitively obvious. The safety ones, or anything that they identified as being a safety issue, they flag it as safety. Performance and integrity is something that it's not broken yet, but we may be thinking that we should be fixing it because it's something of an important piece of equipment. Accessibility has everything to do with ADA and making the school accessible for students. So if they see glaring things that are accessibility concern, they'll flag it as this plan type. Environmental, anything to do with, well, PCBs, asbestos, outdoor underground fuel oil storage tanks, if there's evidence or commentary that it might be leaking. And the bulk of the findings fall under retrofit and life cycle renewal. And this is basically, life cycle renewal comes down to, I have a roof that's rated for 40 years. Life cycle renewal says 10 years into it, I should be planning in 30 years to renew that roof. So these plan types and condition types are just descriptors used for sorting through the database to find out how much do we have in safety, how much in life cycle renewal. Okay, I'm going to move on to slide 11. We kind of addressed this real quick a few slides ago, but the terminology is something that in the reports, anything that's an immediate need or a key finding are things that the assessors highlighted as something that they feel is important enough to call out with these two qualifying statements of immediate needs and key findings. All key findings are in the immediate needs, but not all key findings are immediate needs. And so it's just a hair splitting here, and it doesn't impact the rest of our discussion here. But as school districts look to prioritize within their own schools, some of these things become more relevant. All right, slide 12 is where we start getting into some good stuff in terms of helping us prioritize how we might look to spend our money in the state, given that we have a fixed bucket of money, but have needs that probably exceed what's available. So the facility condition index is a measure of determining a school building's health, any building's health, but in this case, a school building's health. And the facility condition index is it's a mathematical calculation, and it takes a look at what are the dollars that it takes to replace pieces of equipment that have now come to a useful life of 0, and you sum all those pieces of equipment up, that cost, and you divide it by the current replacement value of that building. So the current replacement value is based on whatever the going market rate is for construction. We're thinking somewhere up in the neighborhood of $580 a square foot. You multiply that by the square feet, and that gets your current replacement value. And then whatever dollar value of your component systems of the building are, you divide that dollar value by the current replacement, and it gives you this index. And that's the table you see before you here. I broke down the percent of schools that are in each of those ranges, 0 to 5, and you can read the descriptor for the ranges. Anything that's 30% and above has kind of reached its useful life, and renewal is necessary. We only have 4.9% of the buildings there, but look right behind it. There's a slew of buildings. 61% of our building stock is right behind that. And I don't have the breakdown for how many are, like, say, a 29, 28, 27. But nevertheless, it does speak to, it's another way of looking at the comparing the inventory, which I'm going to do in a second. The prior inventory kind of showed some high numbers, and that used a number that was called the depleted value index. This here is the facility condition index. They're related, but not the same. But most people were thinking high numbers in the 70s to 90s. And it's not that those numbers are wrong. It's that they're using a different way of calculating it. And I'll go into that in a second here. So the next slide kind of gives you an overview of what the difference is between the depleted value index versus the facility condition index. The depleted value index, it's a measure of the building's overall amount of consumed system life. And if I had more time, I go a lot into that. But basically what is this? When they do the depleted value, there are tables that tell us in a school building, K through 12 building, the roof might constitute 10% of the total building systems. The plumbing system may constitute 15%. HVAC may constitute 5%. And so what they do is they take the total system components, and then they calculate how much of the remaining useful life of that component is depleted. And if it's fully depleted, if the roof in the Newport school represents 20% of the building facility systems, and it's fully depleted, it's going to contribute 20% towards a depleted value calculation. But if that roof was 20 years old and it's rated for 40, it would only have half amount of contribution to the depleted value. And so they do this for every system, and they come up with a depleted value index, which is really just a measure of how consumed all of the systems are of the total building system total. The facilities assessment comes in, and now you have, and that depleted value index was based on self-reported numbers by the school district. So if the school was built in 1970 and there was no feedback that said, was the boiler system or heating system upgraded since then, they assume the heating system was upgraded in installed in 70, hasn't been upgraded. And so that heating system would be fully depleted. Now, when they get there for the facilities assessment, they find out, oh, that was updated. The boiler has a tag on it from 2000. Now they know, oh, it's not fully depleted, and we're going to calculate that into the facility condition index, just like we discussed before. So there's a difference between the indexes. The important thing is no matter what index you use, when we're talking about a portfolio of buildings across the state, it's not the specificity of the individual school that's important for the state perspective. It's now look at our whole portfolio and what percentage is in high need, middle need, and low need, right? And that helps us prioritize or develop a prioritization schema as how we might want to tackle this big nut of facilities deficiencies. All right. The supplemental evaluations, we talked about the square foot and the PCB, the school educational capacity programming space. I want to just say, please highlight that and keep it in your mind, because when we get to the end, I think this is an important topic of conversation going forward, because this is coming from the people in the field, the educators and the administrators saying, we either do or don't have adequate classroom space, adequate overall building space. The big ones now, because services and needs have evolved and changed over time and become more demanding, do we have enough confidential or any confidential space to deal with any of the FERPA, HIPAA, or IEP requirements? And these are very important because, again, we might fix a building that has a footprint that doesn't address any of these shortages, and we may fix it up, but it's not addressing any of these concerns about capacity and utilization. Okay. And then the next table is basically an overview of what the STEM evaluation looks like. And every school has had this happen. And they get a STEM suitability score. And many of the schools don't have impressive suitability scores. So we may put a new roof, a new heater, new flooring, take all the asbestos out, and we still have a school that doesn't give us STEM educational capability. So it's just another thing that we should think about later on in the conversation. So that's what it goes into the facilities assessment at an individual school level. That gets rolled up to the district level. Now we're going to start talking about what does that mean for a typical district and what does it mean for the state as a whole. So I didn't want to do cost projections for 52 school districts. So I gave a few samples here with 3 school districts, and we'll get into that now.
Nice big font I see on cost projections.
Oh, dear.
Hey, you're lucky I didn't put it in red. So, all right. So I'm just going to put some qualifiers in about the cost projections. And there's a lot, we could spend the next 2 hours talking about qualification, but Jill warned me not to do that. So the cost derives. The costs derived from the assessment represent replacement in kind costs. This is kind of an important concept for you all, because if you have an old boiler that's an 80% efficiency boiler, this is just looking at what does it cost to replace that kind of boiler. But in 2024, we're not going to put in an 80% efficient oil boiler. We're going to probably put in a 92% condensing boiler that has a lot more energy output for the BTU's input, right? And so the replacement in kind is just saying, I have an old Model A and I'm going to estimate what it costs to replace a Model A. And yet we have all these modern cars and EV cars, right? So even though these costs have identified systems that need replacement, it's just saying I'm going to put in the old thing that was there. And so that should be something that we talk about and think about, because when it comes to putting in new equipment, it may have the same footprint. You may be able to get it through the boiler room doors, but we're not going to put on the antiquated controls package. And we're probably going to integrate it into a building management system that also is tying into the air handling, so that we're making sure the right amount of hot water at the right temperature is getting up to that coil in the air handler on the roof. So when we talk about replacement in kind, it does not capture all the costs that we will see to correcting all these deficiencies, but they don't know what we're going to do. They don't know what we're going to choose. And that's why the way of doing it is just saying, well, we know what it is. We're going to replace it with something of like kind. What we do with that in the future is really up to optimizing technology in the current. And therefore, there's going to be a price differential there that we must consider. These costs don't address any modernization initiatives in equipment or educational programming spaces. So it goes back to that space utilization analysis. If the school district says we don't have enough one-on-one counseling rooms, and we go ahead and beautify it and dress it up, but we haven't addressed that, there's still a shortage. And is that something we want to tolerate, or is it something we just need to consider and understand the ramifications of not doing that? These costs don't address overcrowding, and they may not that exist now, and they do not certainly look at to what current enrollment projections may be, whether they be going down or going up. So again, we may be fixing a building that and we make it look good, but boy, if it's 50% overcrowded, all we did is make a nice box that the kids are tight in. All this to say, there will be additional costs incurred, and how we quantify those costs, you'd have to be Houdini to know that exactly, and I would run the lottery already if I knew. All I'm saying is there's got to be a placeholder for capturing that kind of cost. Okay, so just to give an example of what an individual school district would see if they were to look into the system expenditure forecast projected out over the next 21 years. And the one thing I just have to qualify is this: at the time that this assessment started, it was early 23 or late 22. So the immediate column is already late. We're already a year into it because this immediate column is really 2023, but now we're into 2024. So we're kind of behind the 8 ball in terms of this. So everything it can be shifted, right? But with inflation happening, escalation is going to be happening as we speak, right? So if this was identified in 23, take inflation for the year, add it on, and now that might be the cost is not accurate right out of the gate. These are just gross numbers to help inform the state on spending. So this is Addison Central School District on slide 18. This is what they will see for their spending over time. You'll see down below it says inflation 4.27%. The Construction Aid Task Force, one of the contributors to that is David Epstein from Truex Collins, and he had made commentary that he thought that the inflation of 3% that BBTA used was a little low. So Jill and I have done some investigation into this, and it actually turned out that he was correct. So it's good that he was on the team. And it turns out the inflation is more like 4.271 compounded annually for the past 23 years. That's what we're looking to project going forward into the future. So that's Addison.
You would say for folks, Addison Central School District is probably 9-10 school buildings.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep. And here's Champlain Valley. I just threw in 3 of them just so people could get a feel for what we're looking at. And then I also did Maple Run. And if you take a look at Maple Run, it has 7 million in immediate needs. Champlain Valley has roughly 2 million. And Addison has 5.4 million. Yeah. So now the next slide is probably where we can get a little deeper into costs. And I apologize, I made a mistake where it says 2.32%. It should just be 2.32. So it's not a percentage increase, it's an actual total multiplier. So the school facilities assessment came up with a dollar value. Jill and I have also been working on the COF, which is the capital outlay financing formula. That was another mandate out of Act 72 that we update the capital outlay financing formula. When we were doing the work to do that, we came up with substantial increases in what the dollar value per square foot to build a school building is in Vermont. And we wanted to align the costs coming out of the facilities assessment with our research and history on the COF update. In order to marry those numbers to be meaningful and relatable, we developed this multiplier of 2.32. So any costs that have derived from the facilities assessment, once we implement the dashboard that Jill referenced by September of 24, these costs will be reflective and in alignment with our COF formula numerical adjustments. So it's kind of like we were trying to make sure that once we get this out there, the numbers align with each other. So this table of numbers that you see here, the expenditure forecast, this is with that 2.32 multiplier applied. And at the very bottom for each of those, that gives you the summary of annual spending in those time periods. And the next slide kind of gives you those numbers more succinct, so it's not as noisy with all the rows there. And you can see, if you were to take that total, that represents actually 21 years of spending. And if you average that out over the 21 years of spending, and this has inflation built into it, it roughly comes out to 300 million. But if we add in those other unknown costs that we just talked about, that we cannot predict, we have to do some kind of adder or multiplier, whatever terminology we like to use, to take this from this actual literal 300 million, and the costs are going to be much, I would say they're going to be larger than what this reflects because of all those unknown costs associated with what we just talked about, changing boilers to modern boilers. If a school has unit ventilators all around the perimeter of the school, I don't think anybody right now would replace it with a unit ventilator. You would go for a central air handling system that has filtering so that if we ever came across another epidemic, we would have in place the filtering to deal with those kind of concerns. So putting in unit ventilators might be cheaper, but it's not wiser. And those costs are going to be added to this bottom line total of 6 million, and they will be larger. What percent larger is anyone's guess, but I think we need to talk about making sure we talk about having some sort of multiplier adder involved.
Which is to say, 300 million per year is not the right number. And it's probably more like, you want to tell us, or is it just too hard to predict that number?
Oh yeah, I think it's too hard to predict, Peter. Only I say this, and it's not to be evasive. I just have known, having done projects, you open up something and then you find out, oh, where you didn't know there was a power feeder through the wall. Now you have to demo the power feeder and backfeed the whole school while you're doing that work. That's just one simple example. But yeah, we talked about in the task force, if you do so many square feet of roofing with on top of deck insulation, code requires you to increase the energy efficiency of the building to the current code. That means you're probably adding more insulation. And when you do that, the snow load grows because it's not melting. And does my roof truss support the extra weight of that uncalculated snow load? And then if you do that, you have to build all your roof curbs up to hold your air handlers. And if you're doing that, why would you put an old air handler on a new roof curb? So it just snowballs, right? And so these are the realities of this. No one should ever take these numbers and say, well, the state said it was 300 million a year. It could very well be 500 million a year. It could be more. I doubt it's going to be less. Okay, so what I think is very telling slide is slide 21. And I only did this as a theoretical concept analysis, not that is a reflective of any idea that this is what the state's looking to spend or anything like that. It just helped me kind of understand the magnitude of the problem and what if we don't make a significant dent in it year on year, what does it mean in terms of the schools and the children in those schools and our goals of modernizing schools and having equitable access to safe and healthy schools. So it's a noisy spreadsheet, and I apologize for that, but there's something that we need to talk about. Depending on how much money the state applies towards the construction program, should they reinstate one, if there's going to be a match between the state and what the local district has to bond, if the state just theoretically said $10 million a year is what we're going to start our school construction aid program at, and that was a 30% contribution to the project, if you do the math, that means if the state's only putting up 10 million, the school districts as a whole put up 23 million for a total dollar value of 33 million for the year. Right? That's so 10 million is 10% of 33. 23 million is 70% of 33. So if the state puts up 10 as a 30%, school districts are on the hook for 70%. If you go to the yellow line on the spreadsheet, in 2024, if we were to start construction today and address the immediate needs, we would be looking at $297 million of projects. If we only contribute between the state and the local district 33 million, it means we have 264 million to roll over to the next calendar year. You add that on to that calendar year identified project need, and you see that yellow line, the total dollar commitment required to address the needs just continues to grow by each prior year's underfunded spending. And this is an eye popper to me because we never catch up. I ran this out to 2100 and the numbers keep growing. Okay. So this is kind of like, whoa, all right. So if we're starting a construction program and we're not funding it equal to the need out there, there's going to be this snowball carryover effect. And I think that's impactful because the ones at the end of the line when you think of that FCI index, we had 61% of our buildings in the 10 to 30% range. Once you kick over to 30, it's like, oh my gosh, we have a problem. 61% of our school building population is just about tipping over that edge into the critical category. And if we're not funding it because of realistic limitations of available resources, there is a collateral effect to that. And that is some schools are going to continue to deteriorate. And what do we do with those conditions? So I found this for me. This wasn't for everybody. This is for me. I just kind of thinking, whoa, look at the size of this issue. And if we're just going to spend this is just like scratching at the periphery. And it's to me, it was a very impactful way of looking at the magnitude of the problem. Okay, so in slide 24, the summary of program spending. This is kind of just a little bit of narrative that Jill thought would be helpful talking about that spreadsheet. And here are just a few points to talk about. If the level of the spending to address the needs is less than what's required, the cost of those unaddressed needs just roll over into the next year. And this snowball effect will lead to an annual project need that escalates. And at this spending level of 10 million versus 30% from the state, 70 from the districts at a 10 million level, there's no catching it up. And I did multiple analyses on this, and it's not till you get up around $150 million that annually that you actually start to catch up by around 2038, but that's huge. So this is just a theoretical, and I'm not suggesting that this is anything under discussion or that it should be. It just was a way of coming up with numbers to frame out the discussion. All right, and then the next steps, the school construction.
Actually, I'm going to hold you there for a second, Bob, if you don't mind, and just see if there are questions on the information presented before we start talking about next steps. Representative Buss?
Hi there. Thank you so much. This is extremely deep and a really easy way to understand the gravity and magnitude of this problem. How do we look at the difference between renovation versus new construction and how that folds into the mix? Because we did a renovation study at our school, and it was way more expensive to continue renovating than it was to build a new. And then if we built a new, then our carrying costs went down so quickly over time with energy efficient buildings. So I'm just wondering how we look at that.
I think that's a great question. I think there's many opinions on that, but I mean, I come from a background in industrial engineering where there were certain thresholds over which if you're spending more than 65% on doing a renovation, you just build new. And so everybody seems to have their own tipping point where they say beyond this cost, we should look at doing new. But I think, as always, it's never such an easy answer because there are different initiatives that come out at a state level, perhaps. We want to reduce carbon emissions. We want to have certain energy efficiency. And when you take a look at some of these other requirements, some of them by themselves push technologies into buildings that may not be suitable for them. So some of these old school buildings, if you were to try and become more energy efficient, they may not have the ceiling to height, floor to ceiling clearance to even put HVAC ductwork into the whole network of the corridor and into the spaces. So everybody should and would want to do a building management, automated controlled heating and ventilation system. Not all schools can even incorporate that into their physical infrastructure. So there's realities of limitations that sometimes dictate what you can and can't do. And so I know the task force has talked about what is that balance on the seesaw of going to modernization versus renovation. And I think it's got to be almost a district by district review unless there's a huge incentive from the state in order to do modernization in some way. Because your point, and I could go forever, your point is so interesting, right? Because if we're talking about modernization, now we're injecting into the ability to make the school building handle STEM and STEAM. We're talking about space utilization that even though the buildings haven't changed, the educational needs and services required are changing. And this would be the time to strike and say, what do we envision our school looking like if we modernize? Because repairing and rehabilitating old schools doesn't necessarily achieve all the goals. It just makes it safe, warm, and dry, but it hasn't achieved anything to do with STEM capacity utilization, or energy initiatives that the state or others may impose on us as we move forward with climate change and climate resiliency? So it's a wonderful question, and it's no easy answer.
And one example that we can, because other states have wrestled with the same question, right? It's an excellent one, and districts wrestle with it all the time. The Rhode Island model has one of their sort of state share bonuses is that if the building has a FCI index of 60% or more, which is a really understanding that an FCI index of 30% really means that a third of your school, in essence, is defunct. So an FCI index above 60%, they basically have a bonus to replace the school. They sort of cut their losses at that point and sort of acknowledge that that's an old car that you don't necessarily want to keep putting money into. So there are models and examples out there that we can look at from other states of how they've tackled that. We do have recent examples in some districts where, for example, in Winooski, they kept their original building. They did a major renovation and added on some additional space. And it's really become kind of a model of how you can take an existing building and modernize it. And I think we're all quite pleased with how that has come out. In Milton, for example, they were looking at that kind of cost benefit between doing a new build or another kind of major renovation. And they determined that doing a new build was, as you said, sort of slightly more expensive on the front. I think it was something like 20% more expensive, but actually would have major cost savings and other benefits down the line. So there's no good answer to it, but it's a really great question.
And those downstream carrying costs, yeah.
Absolutely.
About
Yeah.
Representative here.
Yeah, I think two numbers questions. One, I remember Joe or Bob said the current school construction figure is about 580 a square foot, I think I heard. And I'm recalling when we were looking at my community and doing a new build, this would be dollars from about 5 years ago. I think it was half that. And I recall the construction escalator being maybe 5% a year. So did the pandemic just throw everything that crazy out of whack, and will it come back to earth if so?
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
gonna let Bob answer this because he actually did a lot of sort of research. We were doing this for the capital outlay financing formula. So he did quite a bit of research to come up with that number. So Bob, if you want to speak to that, I know you've done a lot of great work on it.
Yeah, sure. I think the microphone was breaking up a bit, but I heard something about the 580 and what it was good from 5 years ago.
So I'm referring to numbers from 5 years ago because that's when my community looked at doing a new build. We didn't do it. And I recall the figure being about half of that.
Yes. Okay, yes. So there has been a price escalation. If you look at the past 3 years, I think 2021 had like a 16% price spike in construction. And there's quite a few things, not necessarily unique to Vermont, but there's only so many contractors in the area, so many that can actually take on the work. And I know from having just personally dealt with a lot of contractors, if they're too busy, they'll just throw out a highball figure. They don't really need the job, but if they get it, it's bank for them. And so there's a lot of things that go into the pricing of that. But what we ended up doing is we went with some big price estimation companies in New England, Vermeulen's, PM&C out of Boston. And then we talked to Turner Construction here, and then some people that I had worked with in my past job. And it ended up being where the construction price index does not track the consumer price index. And that's what Dave Epstein was alluding to in the task force. So the construction price index has been at 4.271 year on year growing. And so that's why we changed our numbers from the assessment reflective of that inflation rate. And then what we also did is we took a look at what are the actual school building quotes coming in now for schools in Vermont. So you take a look at Burlington, you take a look at what was proposed up in Milton with Truex Cullens. They've made a proposal for that. And those costs are coming in over $700 a square foot. Now, let me qualify that because the $580 a square foot is just to build a building. There's now going to be site costs. What is the work that you have to do on the site to get the road in there, any of the utilities, any of the excavation associated with that? That's as variable as all of us are in the room here because some sites have total ledge. BGS, I was talking to Joe Aja, BGS, they had one state facility where the cost for site work was $32,000 a square foot because they had to blast the whole foundation, right? So it's not to say that schools hopefully would be placed on a building lot that has that kind of ledge. You do some exploratory drilling before you would build, but there's site work that's included. that's not included in the 580. There's demolition, that's not included in that. And then there's no cost in that 580 for if you have on-site waste treatment facilities because you're not connected to the municipal sewer. So the 580 is just the cost to do the building. It does not incorporate the soft costs of engineering, permitting, any kind of hazardous substance testing and remediation. So the costs that we're seeing, and Jill and I were down in DC a month ago, and somebody said they now have a quote over $1,000 a square foot for building a school. So the price continues to shock, and I don't think that would be changing anytime soon.
Thank you. And then the second number I wanted to question, not because I questioned it, just because I don't understand it, is the 2.32. What does that do and where is it derived from?
Absolutely. Awesome. So this is what it did. So when BVTA did the facilities assessment, they used a $250 per square foot for their construction current replacement value. And we knew going into it that that's low. That seems quite low, given that we were just talking about 580. So the way we generated the 580 was we updated the COF formula, and the COF formula has multiple tables in it, but one of them is the unit construction cost table. And there's different unit construction costs for, say, a K through 6 high school and then a vocational tech, right? Because then the infrastructure gets more, not higher level, but there's just more infrastructure in the high school. They may have shower and locker rooms where a K through 6 may not have that. The cafeteria may be bigger because of student population. So what we did is we took a weighted average of what our unit cost was for high schools and elementary schools, and we weighted it based upon what's the number of schools and what percentage is elementary at 570 a square foot, what percentage is high school at 620, and it averaged out based on that weighting to be 580. Then to get the $250 square foot value that the assessor was using, the multiplier to get the 580 was 2.32.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, Representative Austin.
Yeah, I think it's more directed to you.
Okay.
Are we gonna look at, I mean, I feel like school population is dropping. I don't know if we're at 70,000 kids right now. I mean, it's dropped probably 30,000 kids in the last 10 years. Are we looking at possibly another model of delivering education where kids could come out with an excellent education, but just not fixing up every single school, like looking at regional or other options?
The answer to that is we will get potential recommendations from the school construction aid task force.
Mhm.
And part of the task of the task force was to discuss prioritization of state aid. And you create a scoring system.
Yeah.
And so if you think about the Rhode Island model, one of their sort of mottos is newer and fewer.
Mhm.
And so that would, if we were to adopt a newer and fewer prioritization, that would address a declining enrollment.
And we possibly could look at that as an option.
Definitely.
Okay.
Sure. Great. So why don't we go on to next steps?
Okay, you're soon done with hearing me. So, all right. So the next steps. So why all this work? All this work was to then, out of Act 78 of 23, the Joint Task Force was created for the school construction aid. And our work through the facilities assessment was basically to be able to funnel information to the task force, which they could then use to come up with recommendations as how to move forward with all the information that's been generated. The powers and duties of that task force are outlined on that last slide, 26. And it's basically just saying, what are we going to deal? What we need to understand, what are the needs, programmatic from an educational standpoint, and safe and healthy conditions of those schools. What are the funding options that the state has within its wheelhouse to try and figure out how to creatively address all these needs? Determining what type of governance structure should be over whatever entity oversees school construction within the state. Number 4, the appropriate state action level for response to the PCBs and how to integrate that into a construction program, if at all possible, so that it has the least impact. And then a criteria for prioritizing school construction funding. So these are kind of things that just related to Peter's answer right there. So the construction aid task force by February 1st will be issuing a report, I think, to the legislature that has all of these 1 through 5 well, at least, yeah, they'll have all these issues identified in them for the legislature to consider. And then I guess I'll just close with some, what I think are some takeaway things to consider as you noodle all of this information, which is a lot. It's like drinking from a fire hose. I understand that. So I think if I were to summarize just my involvement in the 6-7 months I've been here at the AOE in the facilities assessment and understanding what's going on with the schools, I think just my wife was a teacher, and talking to Jill and talking to other educators, over time, it seems that student needs have grown and the need for services to address those needs have grown, but the buildings have not. So the spaces within the building are not necessarily adequate, even for the level of services that we have now. And so I keep harping back to the idea, fixing something that's not even delivering what we minimally say we need now. Is that a good fix? The second thing I like to think about is education's been changing and the buildings have not. And the initiatives around 21st century learning and having places in place for STEM and STEAM education, none of those costs are addressed in this whole facilities assessment. Hence my caution that there's going to be more costs if we're looking to do 21st century education with the appropriate services and STEAM and STEM education. And then the follow-up, I guess the last point I want to just stress is these costs do not fully capture all the costs that we can expect to incur. And there's a category of follow-up studies. A lot of it has to do with ADA accessibility, but several have to do with building facades, seeing cracking in facades, structural weakness in beams and posts, underground fuel oil storage tanks, and concerns about leakage. These follow-up studies are going to generate recommendations for projects to remediate whatever the problem is. The quantification of those costs is not known to us now, but we need to think that if the costs are X now, there's going to have to be an adder onto that. And that's the reality of it. So those are the three highlights that I just wanted to leave you with. And thanks for listening.
Representative Buss, please
So
pull us out of this.
Someone say something positive.
Well, I will tell you that something positive that I looked at. So my school district's financial team that's looking at our school construction, and they did determine that it should be brand new. If we pierce the roof of our middle school, then it crumbles. So we can't do anything to the roof. We have to evacuate our school when the basketball game is playing and the snow load gets a little high and it sounds really awful. So we abandon the school ball game. So, we've looked at a lot of this. So when we did the new numbers and we put them into our calculator, we do lots of things. We're like, okay, it's going to be a 32% increase to our taxpayers. That's unacceptable. But if we stretch the bond out, it's this. If we get a lower interest rate, it would do this to the taxpayers. If we were able to get so much help in those first 5 years, that's how it would stretch out. And so what we do see over the long run is that new construction does help lower the overall cost of the school quite dramatically. So are we just looking at a 30, but okay, then let me back up and say one more thing. Then we looked at if the state gave us a certain amount of money and it was over the course of the whole life of the 40-year bond, let's say, that was not nearly as meaningful to our taxpayers than if there was a smaller amount of money that just came at the top in those 5 years of the bond's paying period. So our tax base said, hey, we'd love to carry this. We just need 5 years of assistance. And so I'm just wondering, looking at it differently, if we had two options of like, do you want more money over 40 years or do you want a lower amount of money over 5? It seems like we could almost make a more meaningful impact that way. And that's what I got to say.
I think that's certainly, it's part of the school construction aid task force is led by AOE and Treasury. And there was a reason that Treasury was involved in that. And it's exactly for those reasons to look at ways that we fund this effort. Again, I'll say Rhode Island has taken an approach that I know you all had a really great presentation from Mario last year. But their approach does sort of acknowledge that those sort of upfront costs to get folks started are really critical and can be really important in actually getting the community to successfully pass their portion of it, their bond, is by having that kind of upfront, I think they call it PAYGO, something like that. They've structured their financing system to be able to support that as well as kind of the long-term bonding. So that I think is again, something that the task force will be presenting and something for you all to chew on in terms of what are the ways that local communities are going to have to pay some portion, right? I don't think we exist in a world where the state can pay 100% of school facilities and construction. So how can we get local communities, especially those who traditionally have not been able to pass those bonds, right? How do we get the community's buy-in and support? And I don't think it's just the funding. I think it's selling the message of what do our school, we as the state have put a lot of emphasis on equitable access to high quality education. But the piece that we've never really touched is the school buildings themselves. And so selling that message that the buildings themselves matter in the experience of the student and the pride that communities have in their schools, I think that's a really critical part of the message as well. And you all can help with that.
Bob, did you want to add anything to that? I didn't know if you were looking to talk about that bond payment and the upfront principal payment and whatnot.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there has to be a paradigm shift in how we think. We have to divorce ourselves from how we've thought in the past, and we have to come up with a creative way to deal with the actual issues that exist today. And the only thing that I would say as a taxpayer, not even as an AOE employee, is this. Sometimes there are multiple initiatives that come out that are all wonderful initiatives in and of themselves, but they don't necessarily think of how to integrate it with other mandates that are coming down the pipe. So as I think of schools going forward, to the earlier discussion about newer and fewer, is that a viable option? I think all options need to be assessed and thought for pro and con. What are the strengths and weaknesses? Nobody is going to be happy with any solution we have. There's going to have to be a consensus about what is the best thing going forward. And when I think about all the various initiatives, and sorry, Jill, and probably Jeff have to hear me say this again, but if there's a mandate to get within the next 10 years, broadband access to every grid-connected house in Vermont, we need to be also integrating that into schools that become emergency op centers during climate events. And so should we be looking, just take away any emotion from the analysis. And Jill and I have talked about, if you can do GIS overlays and take a look at what are the climate issues that Vermont faces, whether it's flooding, mudslides, fire, whatever. And then take another layer on that same GIS map that's saying, what about our IT backbone that we need to make sure everybody in the state gets access to IT in case we have another pandemic and the school kids find themselves at home? Should the schools become IT hubs? And does that require relocating those schools to geographically significant areas that make every school a backbone, not only for the kids, but an emergency network should something major happen? And now we have schools that are resource centers for the community in terms of disaster. They can be connected by the broadband access that has been done through analysis. And then we've talked about repurposing schools that get shut down and maybe converting that properties into accessible and affordable housing for school staff to bring them in, or nursing staff that's in shortage in Vermont. So I think it's time now to strike the iron of creative thinking and incorporate it not just into the school facility program, but not have the legislature enact new laws that may impact this and make it more expensive and therefore make it preventing from happening at the local level. We need to integrate our thinking forward as the strategic view going forward, not these little silos of wonderful thoughts, but have no way of meshing.
Please.
When we look at newer and fewer, or when we look at the whole needs assessment, is there a map that shows this school district has this many buildings and here's how many kids go to each of those buildings?
Yeah, so it's all data that exists. And our next phase of work is to actually take the information we got from the school facilities assessment, take existing data we have on enrollments over the past 5 years, whatever that is, and do that kind of public facing tool, essentially. It's not just a dashboard, but it's a GIS map. And so we can actually start to do this work. This information exists. This is not additional work that needs to be done. It's work that needs to be integrated so that we can do this kind of comprehensive strategic planning, but also not just us, but districts, right? So that they have the tools to be able to do that as well. And also so that they don't have to think themselves in silos, but they can also, talk between districts as well, right? That's another sort of long-term sort of thinking that we would like to have them engage in. I think there's a lot more to come with the school construction task force work in that presentation. And Bob and I have been operating as technical support on that end, but we would be happy to come back and
As we get more into the task force conversation, it
Yeah.
can become clear, we're not solving everything right now. This is a multi-year process where maybe we set up a framework this year, and then we have an independent authority discuss priorities. But my sort of question, comment, I don't know how to put it, we're not going to meet the annual need, period. There's no way the numbers are too big. So I don't know what the question here is,
it's just a statement.
How many school buildings do we have?
but I guess, we
384.
Yeah. And that, I assume, includes, small schools, superintendent's offices, things like that.
Yes, it does.
I don't know where I'm going with this question, but just to say, Bob, thanks for pointing that out. It is a gobsmacking number. And I think you're right to point out that if we aren't at least chipping away at it, we are always falling further and further, not just behind, but way behind. But it's overwhelming. And help us get over that.
Yeah, shock and awe initially. I think also, we could talk a lot more, I'd be happy to come back and talk about district quality standards and how they align with Act 72 and other. Yeah, and so I want folks to know that this isn't existing in a vacuum and that we're actually, as I said, Act 72 and then subsequently the district quality standards, which came out of Act 127, are all pointing towards identifying what quality looks like, right? A 5-year capital plan, appropriate budgeting for maintenance and operations and long-term capital planning. And that's not a knock on our districts and saying, oh, they dug themselves into a hole. I would say that, the state certainly contributed by suspending construction aid. But we do have the data that shows, if we know that the standard is a 3% maintenance and operation in your budget and capital planning is 4%, so 7% of your annual budget should go towards the ongoing maintenance and operation of your buildings and keeping them to a high standard. I think we can all agree, and the data clearly shows that our districts do not meet that, and they fall short of it by well over, Bob, check my math, well over $150 million a year, right? So we also need to, as we're considering state construction aid, what levers, policy levers, can the state pull to, again, sort of ensure that there's good stewardship of state funds? Right now, the state has no skin in the game. Taxpayers do, right? But the state has no levers to pull because we are not engaged in funding school construction. If we if we fund school construction, we also have the ability to have some oversight and control of how those funds get spent. And then also there's an assurance and compliance process that goes with all kinds of state funds that we send out. So right now we've taken ourselves out of the game in terms of having that sort of input. But we are engaged in a multi-year process of getting ourselves back in. One of those ways that we do that is through the district quality standards, where we establish what does good maintenance look like? What does good training and certification look like? What does good budgeting look like when it comes to our school facilities? And then we have the ability, again, to measure something that we don't currently measure.
What's the status of district quality standards right now?
Yeah, so district quality standards, I have a meeting tomorrow on that. We are re-engaging. So where we got to over the summer is that the state board approved the Agency of Education's proposed district quality standards. Those are very high level statements. Thou shalt do X, Y, or Z. Now we're in the process of actually defining what quality looks like for each of those. And we're doing that in partnership with the field. So we're going to be meeting with business managers, superintendents, facilities managers, the Vermont School Board Association, subject matter experts, to really begin to identify, like, what does high proficiency, we're going to use a proficiency scale, right? If it's good for our students, it's good for our schools and our districts. What does a highly proficient district look like in terms of this standard? And the intention is, the deadline for this is July 2025 is when districts will first engage in their self-assessment. We'll be happy to come in here. This is in my shop as well. We'll be happy to come back in and provide an update on all of the district quality standards and the quality assurance process as well.
Representative Austin?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've looked at other states as well.
Absolutely.
Looked at other where, there's a much higher population of kids going to one school and doing very well in terms of their education. There must be some insight by looking at other states and what they're doing as well, for cost versus benefit.
So, Bob has been invaluable in this, I must say. We looked at well over a dozen states and their different models. So some states really take an approach of just the state kicks in not large sort of chunks of money for major renovations, but they kick in kind of like a ongoing maintenance repair kind of budget, right? Massachusetts takes the model of tiered incentives that are aligned to their priorities. California has a very robust program, as does Colorado. So we've looked at a lot of different models. I would encourage all of you all, once that school construction aid sort of report comes out. I mean, I think this is, really important work, right? Where we tended to follow, previewing here, tends to be more of that Rhode Island model because they're a small state. They have similar kind of enrollment and student population issues. They're a bit more urban than we are, so it doesn't perfectly align. We've also looked at Maine's models. So interestingly, I'm actually going to point you towards something that I think will be surprising. Some of our highest performing schools in the nation are actually those that are run by the Department of Defense. There was a recent article in the New York Times, but they've done some really amazing studies, and they have sort of very standard templates for what they're supposed to look like. They have, like, it's the military, right? It's very top down. Thou shalt have a STEAM lab. Thou shalt have an art, area. Thou shalt have counseling centers or whatever it may be. Thou shalt use an open concept plan or whatever that may be. So they have these like very standard templates. There's other factors as well for why they tend to be high performing schools, but their schools are new and bright and 21st century learning models and tend to have a highly diverse population, a lot of low income students whose parents, are enlisted. They're a very interesting model to look at. I don't know with our highly local control state that we will ever achieve that level of organizational efficiency. But I always find it really interesting to look at them. If you want to look at the other extreme from where we are, I think that's a really interesting model to examine.
So in looking at that, what level of, we're always talking about local control in this committee. What is state level oversight versus local control look like in the relationship of how we do design schools? So great, we want to hold everybody to a 7% capital planning and maintenance process moving forward, but what kind of say do we have if we're providing state funding for what that school needs to look like and service?
I think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. So I think there's many ways that currently any grant program, any funding program that we have, whether it's state or federal dollars, has sort of, I think of as three different sort of levers that can be pulled to either point districts towards specific policy outcomes that we're aiming for, or have oversight over specific behaviors that we expect, right? And so there's eligibility criteria, which we can set. You're only an eligible school if, I'm going to throw out totally fake examples, your FCI index is over 60%. That could be an eligibility criteria. You only are eligible if you have increased your percent of your annual budget for maintenance and operations over the last 5 years by, some percentage that we identify. So you have who gets in the door, and that drives behavior. Then you can set your priorities for, things like state share bonus, right? Tiered systems like Massachusetts. We may, as a state, decide there are specific priorities, newer and fewer, school safety and security, whatever it may be. CTE centers, whatever that is, right? So you incentivize specific kinds of projects by those kind of cost share bonuses. Hey, the state will kick in more money if you do X, Y, or Z. And then on the back end, and we do this with every dollar that we send out with, especially like federal funds, but also all of our grant programs, you have a set of assurances and requirements. In our previous state construction aid program, they had to have ed specifications. They had to engage in a commissioning process that ensured that the project had been carried out as to meet state standards. They had to use a clerk of the works to ensure that throughout the project it was being, done with fidelity and to standard. But you also can have in those assurances, we assure that if we receive these state dollars, that we will have an annual budget of 7%. And then the state has to decide what the consequences are if they don't meet that requirement. We assure that we will have a district-wide facilities manager that meets annual certification requirements as outlined by the Agency of Education that already basically exist in Act 72. So we're pulling a lever that already exists. So we have all these different mechanisms that we use all the time. And by using those sort of three different levers or mechanisms, the state actually has a lot of ways that it can direct behavior that we, and that sounds a little Machiavellian. I didn't mean it that way. To meet the goals and priorities that the state has for its funds.
And have we looked at the cost sharing of, architects throughout all the different school districts, or, full purchasing agreements?
I think those are very smart ideas to consider, right? So, for example, in Massachusetts, they recognize that there's going to need to be a group of architects and engineers that are really familiar with high quality, educational instruction for school buildings, and the state pre-qualifies them. We do this through our buildings and general services all the time. So that's something that, the state could do to streamline the process. The state could also choose to offer grants for master planning if we decided that was an eligibility criteria that we would want to see, so that we know that the district has had some sort of conversation, high-level master planning around, what is our educational vision for our school buildings? What is our enrollment projections, et cetera, et cetera? What are our environmental hazards? Are we sitting in a floodplain, like my future kid high school over here in Montpelier? And so the state could, again, this is an equity issue. You all could choose to create planning grants And that could become then an eligibility criteria. There's lots of different ways that we could do this, and I really look forward to engaging that.
I'm so sorry.
Good questions, go ahead.
So I was talking to my district about the fact that we haven't been able to save money, to put it away in a fund to use later. Because you get to a certain point where if you have reached that 60% of your index, well, you're not going to throw money at the problem, but you want to park money somewhere. So when you are ready to throw it at the problem, you can. Is that a part of looking at this future? Or like if you have a brand new building, how are you going to spend 7%? In your second year of ownership, so
Yeah.
can we put that money away?
Yeah, Bob, I think this is a passion of yours, if you want to.
Yes, but yeah, let's.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess, well, I don't think the 7%, okay, let me qualify something. So the 4% capital planning is typically what you would see for buildings that have been neglected, kind of like our population of buildings in Vermont. 2%, if you have a new building and you do a robust maintenance program, they'll say 2% of CRV would be what you would do towards capital renewal. But nobody's going to start throwing capital money in a new building, probably not till 5 or 7 years down the trail, right? Because there's systems, if you take a look at your life, your expected useful life out of any component, that's going to be before that happens is when you're going to start replacing it, right? Maybe the next year before it happens. But no, if you put in a 15-30-year boiler, you're not going to be doing any kind of upgrade to it within the first 2 years. But there are systems, and then there's components of those systems that you may need to be replacing, right? It may be that the combustion air fan, the bearings fail after 3 years. So there is a certain element that goes into that. But in terms of, if you're saying, I want to hear the question again about the relative to, if you don't have that money to put into a 60 FCI index, you want to start bankrolling that money to when you do have time to actually build a new building. So you basically want to put it into a CD somewhere and let it grow with interest until you get such time that you're building.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So our money's making money while we don't need to be using it.
I think that's awesome thinking.
I think, it's similar to the town that both Bob and I live in. We have a capital budget, which a lot of towns don't. Some towns, they need a dump truck, they throw out a requested town meeting. But we bank money knowing that the dump truck we just bought is going to be 15 years. So starting day one, we start banking money. So in 15 years, we can just buy a dump truck.
Yeah.
I think that's
Is there
so
a statute that's precluded us from doing that? That's what I kind of understood.
I don't know.
Okay.
But I think generally what has precluded us from doing that is the need or the desire among school boards to maintain programs at educational levels and not put money, and then we have a
Right.
deferred maintenance problem.
Yeah.
But to wrap Russ's question, I thought it was the case that we could not enroll more than 100,000 from fiscal year to fiscal year.
My understanding of this, and I'm a little bit out over my skis, so I would actually like to take the question back and provide you with an answer. We have some districts that have the ability to put away more money than that in their sort of capital fund that they have available. I'm not sure what the mechanism is by which they do that, but I know like Burlington School District does that.
It's very standard.
Yeah.
If you have a
Yeah.
fund, so you can then roll that into a capital.
Yeah, I actually think it's a district by district decision, and that maybe there's not a state law precluding it, but let me research that and I will get an answer for you all. I know Cassandra Ryan knows the answer on that one, so.
Go for it.
Do we,
You are your district is at the forefront of this issue, so your questions are well appreciated.
okay, this is just of course, we probably know this, but out of 384 school buildings, what is the total square footage? Like if we demolish all schools and.
Bob knows this by heart.
Yeah, it's just under 18 million.
Square feet. Okay.
Is the follow-up question to that, how many do we need based on current school population?
That is it. Although the Vermont Business Magazine just said that we topped out at attracting more people to our state, by the way.
Based on school capacity or based on available housing?
Just the National Movers study United Van Line.
No, that's
But they
hardly a
use the
scientific
net
study.
Educational expert.
Well, it would feel better.
I was gonna, yeah, but do they look at how many people left? Because usually it's zero.
Right.
The number coming in and the number leaving.
We actually gained kids in our district in the last 5 years. We're excited. It was only 7 children, but I'm still good. I'm still excited.
I would say that this facilities assessment, it had that self-reported ed capacity survey. I'll just address why we didn't do that for this facilities assessment. It's really, really expensive. And we were using state Art Besser dollars to pay for it, and we didn't have the money or time to do it. So yes, I think that it's an excellent question. To what extent does the state or a district or a region have some sort of long-term strategic plan that includes many of the things that we've already talked about, but includes enrollment projections, right? Where are students? Where are they moving? But also, you know, what does a 21st century school look like? And without editorializing, simply asking the question, do our small schools, which are cherished, and that's understood, actually have the ability to deliver 21st century learning? It's a question to be examined without me offering any answer. But it's a hard question, and luckily I don't have to weigh in on it.
It's an important question.
It is an important question.
Voters don't understand this at all. I try to talk about 21st century learning, and to be honest with you, I would love more.
Maybe we need to define it better. Yeah. What is 21st century learning? What are
Because
the
people
elements?
hear, oh, that's just too expensive, and we went to this high school and it served us, and we produce great Vermonters, and what do we need to do that's different than that?
Yeah.
And I can't really totally answer that.
Yeah. So I think that's a really great, I mean, this goes back to, again, like I think that I'm using a collective we here, not the royal we collectively really need to engage with our taxpayers who understandably are going to be, you know, looking at these same numbers and just throwing their hands up, right? Especially in this budget cycle. You know, we need to help folks understand that our school buildings, how do I want to say this? That we need to help them understand all of the ways that our schools serve our students today. And it is not how I grew up. You know, we ask our schools to do an extraordinary amount of things, and they are the hubs of mental health systems, public health systems, you know, they feed all of our students. I mean, you know, people often ask, why is AOE in charge of mass feeding during emergencies? And I say, what do our schools do every single day? They mass feed, right? You know, we have models of community schools, which has been an initiative in the legislature, and we're seeing it play out, and they're extraordinarily successful, right? So how can we help our understandably skeptical taxpayers understand that a 21st century school is not a school from Star Trek, right? And that a 21st century education really looks fundamentally different from how we all learned. And, you know, that's just something that I don't think a lot of folks actually step foot in schools necessarily. So I think we collectively have work to do to help people understand, what does that mean? It's not space age. It's not even 22nd century learning it. We're just aiming for this century.
They're just calling it Cadillac. They're like, we just want Subaru.
Yeah.
We are commissioners.
Well, we're Vermonters. We would love a good, sensible Subaru Outback. I think that's something that we should aim for, right?
Yeah.
Representative Taylor.
Going back to your last question there, Senator Buss, our district, I believe, when there is a surplus, it goes out to vote on the ballot on meeting day on if that surplus can be put into a fund balance to be utilized in a specific.
Right.
So that might be the mechanism that needs to happen. Not positive, but I think that's.
Thank you. Yeah, I made it sound like you just do it. It does require a vote. I think as has been pointed out, this is really the start of the conversation. And I think that it's given us a look at the lift ahead that is for this committee as we grapple with it. The task force report will provide guidance, but we're going to have a lot of big decisions to make as to how we answer a lot of these questions, which probably is going to be a combination of leaving it to others. We've set up a mechanism, but also we're going to have to answer ourselves. And I guess, but having listened to both of you today, it's going to be really important that you continue to help us and guide us, and don't let us forget some of the big questions we need to ask. You know, Bob, as you were talking about what a school needs to be and bringing up things like, you know, tech hubs and all that. We'll probably forget those things. So please, we'll bring you in repeatedly to sort of check on our progress.
Okay, that sounds good.
As you can all tell, Bob is worth his weight in gold, and I'm so very grateful to have him.
Well, I do have a question. This was really a major undertaking and all that. Bob, what is the role of your position now moving forward?
Well, I just do whatever I'm asked to do. And, so it's really, I'm working, it's kind of slid to the background, but working on developing that training curriculum with Visbit for the facilities managers, choosing an appropriate certification program and trying to work out the details. What does it mean for the school districts that have people that are doing it, but that are not certified? So there's a lot of details in the weeds that we got to iron out to make that program seamless and fair. And then working with Jill and Courtney on DQS on the facilities aspects once they draw me into that net. And then working with schools. I think just today, Jill was saying that I might be starting to merge into some emergency construction funding aid with schools that may have some issues cropping up with rainwater or mold infiltration into their school. So I'm really here to help however needed.
Yeah, great.
And Peter, I would say, as you know, the agency went for a U.S. Department of Education grant called the SASE grant. And it was really aimed at state education agencies to build their capacity to support school districts in their facilities. We did not get it, which was really unfortunate. We had identified within that a whole range of technical support. Bob is only one man. He's a very hardworking, highly skilled man, but in an ideal world, if we look at a school facilities program, right, because that's really what his job is, right? It's not just Act 72, but it's the ongoing school facilities program. I would love if we were able to provide people within the agency that can actually help districts as they're trying to work their way through all of these complexities. Another place that I think we have a lack, and there's just literally not enough hours in the day to build this expertise, but there are federal dollars that are outside of the U.S. Department of Education, which is where my expertise has been built over the past almost 4 years. But, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, USDA, there's all of these federal dollars. They all have their own requirements, timelines, complexities. And it is, in working with districts, it's almost impossible for them to go for these dollars, competing with districts in other states that are as big as our entire student population, that have grant writers. We don't even have an agency level grant writer, right? So we are always going to face challenges at both the state and the district level to get a piece of those federal dollars and leverage those and really maximize them in concert with our state priorities without some capacity. I don't know what that looks like, but some capacity to do that. And there's no way that with Bob's workload, he can also take that on. So it was unfortunate that we did not get this grant. I have strong opinions about it. But that was really something that we were pointing to, is that our districts need help navigating these complexities so that they can go after those federal dollars, because they're out there and they just cannot get them. We had some districts that went for the Department of Energy, Renew America's Schools, and nobody got the funds. And it was very in-depth technical application that, frankly, took more time than they had. So and the EPA dollars as well.
That's obviously a theme that cuts across not just education, mental,
Absolutely.
everything. And we touched on it last year. And
Yeah.
I think it's something that Vermont really is going to struggle with is
Yeah.
access to federal dollars.
Yeah.
Real quickly, and not to use your time or anything, but would it be possible like in May to get an update on the EQS work you're doing? Like just to get
The
a.
EQS or the DQS?
We've been talking,
EQS.
that's a different.
That's someone else's job. We're talking about DQS.
I heard EQS.
Yeah, and there is a sort of subcomponent of DQS that touches EQS, but that's separate work that I think's Heather.
I thought it was.
The answer is yes.
Yeah,
We can.
Thank you.
absolutely, but it won't be me.
All right, well, why don't we call it there? Thank you both very much. Super informative presentation.
Thank you for bearing with it. Bob, thank you for only
Thank you.
doing 5 tables, sir. I know that was, he restrained himself.
That was
If folks want to see, those building level reports are, I can send a link, there's an Access Leaching Facilities Adjustment website. I will note that they are point in time reports and many of them are undergoing some revisions because they were done quickly and there are some errors. So they're being, if you want to see the building reports for all of the schools in your district, they're publicly available. I'd be happy to send them.
Yeah, and on that, I'd say we should all keep in mind the caveats that were presented to us.
Yes,
about
please.
these, with things like, well, yeah, a new roof with then more insulation and then new rafters and all that.
And those building reports do not have that 2.3 multiplier in them. The numbers that eventually the dashboard, the public facing dashboard will have that and the inflation cost built into it, but we're not there yet.
And where do we go to find existing language around the capacity that we were discussing about support services and setting up buildings for 21st century learning?
Capital fund
Oh.
outlay formula or whatever it's called.
So
And then there's also what was the other topic AOE and the state board were to take up? Go ahead, Bob.
Okay, yeah, so the state board reviewed, I don't know where it stands in the process of approving the COF, but we had the meeting last month. And I think, Jill, they approved the COF update. And that
Yeah,
update is simply the unit construction costs associated with building the building and then site demo, site prep, and waste treatment development. It didn't update the rest of the COF formula, which applies minimum square footages for programming space and service space and maximum square footage per student by grade level. So those tables have not been addressed and the SBA is, it's within their purview to review that as they see fit.
And I will just say, so the short answer to your question is that the state does not have ed specification standards. That's not something that we have. It may be something that could be required. In the previous school construction aid program, ed specs were required for state approved projects. So those standards don't sit anywhere. But in the previous program, there were standards that, Bob, I think you've probably got your finger on them somewhere and we'd be happy to send them over if you wanted to look. But I'd say they're very outdated. These are from the early 2000s. We would want to take another look at them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And each building report had the self-reported survey from the district. So we asked them a series of questions, do you have the appropriate spaces to do one-on-one counseling or, provide student services or whatever? And they answered yes or no. Those are in those facility assessment building reports.
Thank you.
I'll just
All
add
right.
this, they're not a searchable data field, whereas all these dollar values are, but any of the capacity report is not something that we can search, nor is the STEAM STEM rating and capability at this point.
Yes.
If it's a data point in Asset Calc, the database where the data resides, if that can become searchable, we'll explore that as we move forward with the dashboard implementation.
Great. Well, we look forward to visiting with you both again, probably very soon.
Thank you all
Thank
for the discussion
All right.
today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.